morning light in Hendersonville often arrived as gently as an old friend sliding across the rooftops and settling softly along Cedar Maple Street. That quiet North Carolina town had a way of waking slowly, as if every porch and every maple tree carried its own memory. On most days, the sound of distant birds or the rustle of leaves was all that stirred the early hours. Yet in the year 2018, a sight appeared each morning that made even the oldest residents pause mid-step. At exactly 7 o'clock, a little girl no taller than a porch railing walked down the street with 5 large German shepherds moving at her side. The first time it happened, folks thought their sleepy eyes were deceiving them. The second time, they leaned closer to their windows. By the end of the week, no one could deny what they were seeing. Her name was Emily Carter, though almost no one knew it then. She wore the same faded pink coat each morning, the kind that looked as though it had once belonged to someone who loved her very much. Her small boots tapped the pavement in a steady rhythm as she made her way past the bakery, the florist's shop, and the row of little houses that seemed to sigh with age. Despite her tiny frame, she walked with a calmness that felt older than her 6 years. Beside her, the 5 German shepherds moved with a grace that did not belong to household pets. Their steps were measured and even, their heads lifted, ears alert, eyes scanning every corner as if reading the town before it fully woke. Each dog held a role. One walked ahead. One followed behind. 2 stayed close at her sides. And closest of all was Arcana, a strong shepherd with dark fur that shimmered in the new sunlight. Emily kept her small hand lightly on Arcana's shoulder, not gripping for control, but resting with trust. The people of Cedar Maple Street had never seen anything like it. Some watched from their windows with gentle smiles, believing it was a sweet little scene, something to brighten an ordinary morning. Others pressed their faces closer to the glass with unease. 5 large dogs were a lot for a grown person, let alone a child. And still others whispered to each other over fences or while sweeping porches, wondering how such a tiny girl managed such a commanding presence among animals so powerful. Emily never looked frightened. She never rushed or hesitated. She simply walked. Her eyes stayed forward, her shoulders relaxed, her small stride steady. It was as though she belonged to that morning path, as though the quiet town itself had invited her to take those steps. On some days, a bakery scent drifted across the corner where Mrs. Lucia Ramirez pulled fresh loaves from her ovens. Emily often passed just as the first warm breeze carried the smell of rising dough. The shepherds would lift their noses slightly, taking in the scent, but they never broke formation. Emily would glance toward the bakery door with a softness that suggested memory, but she kept walking. Mrs. Ramirez would pause at the window, one hand pressed to her chest, feeling a tug of affection she could not quite explain. Further down the street, where the trees grew taller and the grass held the morning dew, the walkers from the retirement community often paused on their benches to watch the little procession. Some found themselves thinking back to earlier years when their own children were small, or when their dogs still chased the morning breeze. Emily seemed like a little spark of something they had once known. Something simple. Something tender. Yet beneath the charm of the scene lived a quiet mystery. No adult ever walked with her. No neighbor ever opened a door to call after her. No one stepped out to wave. Emily simply appeared from the direction of the old train depot each morning and vanished beyond the curve where the little church stood. Folks tried to speak to her from time to time. A soft greeting. A question. A kind smile meant to invite conversation. Emily always heard them. She always gave a polite nod, but her voice remained tucked away like a folded letter no one was allowed to read. The dogs answered for her with their calm presence, their protective steps, their unwavering attention to her safety. In a place where everyone usually knew everyone, this quiet child and her loyal guardians became the greatest riddle Cedar Maple Street had seen in years. And as the sun climbed higher each morning, touching every roof with gold, the townsfolk could not help but wonder who she was, where she came from, and why 5 faithful hearts walked beside her without ever letting her go. The whispers began softly at first, drifting across porches and weaving through the narrow spaces between old fences. People in Hendersonville were used to knowing one another. The town carried a gentle rhythm where news traveled more through front yard conversations than through screens. Yet the sight of Emily and her 5 vigilant guardians stirred questions that no one could quite answer. Every morning she appeared from the direction of the old depot, and every morning she vanished near the small church by the curve. No one ever saw her slip into a home. No grown-up ever waved to her from a door. She simply moved like a quiet thread, stitching one end of the town to the other. Neighbors began trying to make sense of it. Some believed she was visiting a relative who preferred privacy. Others guessed she lived just beyond the depot in one of the small rentals tucked behind the trees. A few wondered if she belonged to a family, passing through, staying only until they found their footing. Yet none of these thoughts settled into anything certain, and the absence of certainty made the whispers stronger. The dogs added another layer to the mystery. Hendersonville had seen plenty of pets over the years, from sleepy beagles to shepherd mixes, yet these German shepherds carried a manner that felt far more disciplined. Their movements held purpose. Their eyes scanned with intent. Even the older residents who had once worked in public service noticed it. The dogs were not playful wanderers. They behaved like protectors following a duty, learned long ago. From windows and garden paths, older folks watched with a mix of awe and concern. Some felt an urge to call out to Emily to offer a warm greeting or a gentle invitation. But each time someone tried, the dogs moved with slow, fluid steps, forming a barrier that discouraged further approach without ever raising fear. The message was clear through posture alone. Keep a respectful distance. Emily herself did nothing to deepen or ease the curiosity. She kept her gaze ahead, small face, calm steps steady. She nodded softly at any greeting, her expression polite but guarded. Many wondered what thoughts filled the mind of a child who walked with such composure. There was no sign of fear in her eyes, yet there was no spark of carefree childhood either. It was as if she carried a responsibility too weighty for her delicate frame. By the second week, speculation grew sharper. A few neighbors felt uneasy seeing such a young child manage such powerful animals. Others admired her control, believing the sight carried something beautiful, almost symbolic. Still, no matter how different their feelings were, they shared one truth. No one knew who she truly was. Mornings on Cedar Maple Street slowly changed. People lingered at windows a bit longer. Conversations began earlier. Even the early coffee gatherings on front steps paused whenever Emily passed. Residents long accustomed to predictable days found themselves looking forward to the silent procession, even as it puzzled them. Some felt drawn to protect her, others simply longed to understand her. Yet for all the wondering and watching, no one stepped forward to uncover the truth. Hendersonville was gentle by nature. Folks here respected space, even when curiosity tugged hard. So they waited, they watched, and they whispered. Across the street from the bakery, a retired couple found themselves placing chairs nearer to the window just to catch her morning walk. Near the florist shop, a group of early gardeners paused their trimming whenever the dogs approached, fascinated by their calm precision. The little procession had become a quiet thread tying the town together, though no one yet realized how deeply she would someday touch their lives. Her presence became a story told in soft tones, a blend of wonder and worry. Some mornings, the mist made her look like a small figure emerging from a dream, and on clearer days, the sunlight turned her coat into a glowing patch of gentle color, moving through the early hush. Despite all the curiosity, Emily continued along her path without letting the growing attention change her steady routine. The town watched. The dogs guarded. And a sense of mystery settled over Cedar Maple Street, like morning dew waiting for the moment when the truth would begin to reveal itself. The way those 5 shepherds moved beside Emily soon became the center of every whispered conversation along Cedar Maple Street. To the untrained eye, they might have looked like ordinary dogs walking with a child who adored them. Yet to anyone paying close attention, there was something far deeper woven into their steps. Their coordination was not accidental. Each shift of their bodies carried intention. Each glance toward a street corner or passing car revealed a practiced vigilance, rarely seen outside trained service units. The townspeople sensed it long before they understood it. These were not pets. These were guardians. The first shepherd always walked a few steps ahead, scanning the road as if clearing the way. The last one stayed behind, keeping watch over anything approaching from the rear. The two in the middle maintained a steady position alongside Emily, close enough for her sleeve to brush against their fur. And Arcana, with his dark coat and calm strength, stayed closest of all, matching Emily stride for stride, as though he could feel her quiet heartbeat through the gentle touch of her hand. No matter the weather, no matter the noise, their discipline never wavered. Cars rolled past, early joggers crossed their path, delivery trucks rumbled by, yet the dogs responded with the same steady posture. Their ears lifted, their eyes followed movement, their steps adjusted in perfect synchrony. This was not something a child could have taught. This was the work of skilled hands from years long before. People in Hendersonville talked about it constantly. At the bakery, someone described how the dogs shifted when a stranger approached from behind. Near the retirement home, an older veteran nodded slowly as he watched them, recognizing the calm readiness of animals trained to protect. Even the high school students walking to early classes paused to stare, unsure if they were witnessing something remarkable or simply unusual. Emily never seemed aware of the attention. Her small boots stayed true to path, tapping lightly on the pavement. At times her gaze moved to Arcana, as if checking that he was still beside her, though everyone watching could see that Arcana would never leave her side. She carried a stillness within her, a soft determination that seemed too heavy for such tiny shoulders. There was no fear in her expression, but also no carefree spark that usually danced in the eyes of children her age. The steadiness of the dogs only made the townspeople more curious about her. Some wondered if she came from a family of trainers. Others questioned if she had been raised around working dogs. Yet when they tried to greet her, the shepherds formed a gentle wall that blocked any closer exchange. It was not aggressive. It was protective, calm, steady, the same way a parent might step in front of a child without a word. Each morning brought more speculation. Why did Emily walk the same route? Why did she never speak beyond a nod? Why did the dogs follow her with such devotion? The unanswered questions gathered like shadows along the sidewalks. For a time, people thought the mystery might fade as days passed. Instead, it grew stronger, drawing more eyes to the window panes at 7 o'clock. No matter how deeply the neighbors wondered, Emily stayed quiet, and the shepherds stayed loyal. Their movements seemed almost like living memories, motions taught long ago and carried forward through the bond they now shared with the small girl in the pink coat. Hendersonville had seen many things over the years, yet nothing quite like this. And as the sun rose each morning, brushing gold across the street, the people felt a growing certainty that there was a story behind those steady footsteps. A story larger than any of them yet imagined. The man who finally paid closer attention was not someone the town expected. His name was Thomas Greene, a 56-year-old retiree who had recently settled into a small house near the corner of Cedar Maple Street. Thomas was the kind of man who blended into quiet places without causing a ripple. He moved through his days with the slow steadiness of someone who had learned to live alone, not by choice but by life pressing him into silence. His health had forced early retirement from the postal service after a sudden heart scare, and the loss of his wife years before had left a space in his life that no hobby or routine ever managed to fill. His only child lived far away in Seattle, wrapped in busy workdays and new friends drifting from him, in the gentle way grown children sometimes do without meaning harm. Thomas often rose before sunrise. Old habits from his mail route lingered, shaping his mornings into familiar patterns. He brewed his coffee, opened the curtains, and let the cool mountain air drift through the window. For a long time, he watched the world without expecting anything unusual. It was a comfort to see the same trees, the same soft light, the same quiet street. But the morning he first noticed, Emily changed the rhythm of his days. She appeared so small against the backdrop of the waking town, her pink coat worn at the edges and her boots lifting through the thin layer of mist that hugged the pavement. Thomas paused mid-sip, his gaze pulled toward the sight. The 5 shepherds moved around her with remarkable precision, each one alert yet calm. Something in the way they walked stirred a memory from his years delivering mail when he often passed the training fields used by local service dog handlers. The movements, the posture, the steady awareness, it all looked familiar. These dogs had a history, a serious one. Thomas found himself stepping closer to the window. He watched as Emily passed the bakery, her head down, her tiny hand brushing Arcania's shoulder. Her silence struck him deeply. She looked like a child carrying a burden no one her age should carry. Something tugged at his chest, a feeling he had not allowed himself to acknowledge in a long time. It reminded him of the ache he felt when his daughter left home. It reminded him of moments he wished he could go back and mend. The next morning, Thomas found himself waiting. Coffee ready, curtains open, eyes fixed on the street long before 7. Emily appeared again. Same coat, same steady steps, same devoted guardians. The routine was too precise to be chance. Thomas began bringing a small notebook to his window ledge. He noted the time she appeared, the direction she came from, the way the dog shifted whenever a passerby drew near. He was not investigating, not at first. He was simply trying to understand the weight he saw resting on that small childa's shoulders. As the days passed, a quiet thread formed between Thomas and the morning procession. He never interacted with her directly. The shepherds made sure no one came too close. Yet he felt connected to her in a way he could not explain. It troubled him to think that a young girl walked alone each day with no adult nearby. It troubled him more to see how fiercely the dogs protected her, as if they were the only family she had left. Thomas carried a gentle sorrow inside him, one he rarely spoke aloud even to himself. Seeing Emily stirred that sorrow, but also something else he had not felt in years. A sense of purpose. A sense of responsibility. He could not say why not yet, but he knew she was more than a passing curiosity. She was a child who needed someone to look out for her, even from a distance. And without realizing it, Thomas Greene had already begun to step into that silent role. The more Thomas watched the morning procession, the more he realized that nothing about the way those dogs moved was accidental. From his window, he studied their steps with a careful eye, the same eye that once helped him notice the smallest details on mail routes scattered across mountain roads and quiet neighborhoods. These shepherds carried the presence of animals who had known structure, who had listened to commands, who had learned to respond to danger long before Emily ever held their leashes. Their movements were smooth, disciplined, almost silent in their communication. It reminded Thomas of the way seasoned workers read each other without speaking, the way long-time partners fall into rhythm without thinking. The lead shepherd kept a slow, steady pace several feet ahead, pausing at each crossing as though judging whether the path was clear. The one behind stayed farther back, head turning gently from side to side, watching for anything approaching from the rear. The two on either side of Emily moved like steady shadows, their bodies forming a protective lane around her tiny figure. But Arcano was different. He seemed to treat the little girl not as a handler, but as something precious he'd been entrusted to guard. His gaze softened whenever she reached to touch his shoulder. His steps matched hers with a precision that came not from training alone, but from a bond deeper than most people understood. Thomas recognized that kind of devotion. He had seen it years ago in the canine teams that trained near one of his old delivery routes. Dogs like these learned loyalty the way some people learned breathing. It became part of them. Once bound to a handler, they carried that attachment through every task, every mission, every quiet evening waiting for the next call. That training did not leave easily. It stayed in the bones and the muscles, in the small choices made with every step. He began to notice even more. When a car drove past too quickly, the dogs shifted their bodies, closing in just slightly around Emily. When someone opened a gate across the street, Arcana lifted his head before any of the others reacted. When a neighbor walked their terrier near the corner, the 5 shepherds slowed until the smaller dog passed, ensuring Emily remained untouched by any surprise. These responses were never chaotic. They were controlled, practiced, almost wordless. Thomas wrote everything down in slow, careful handwriting. Dogs adjust formation when vehicle approaches. Emily steady. Oh, kinda closest always. Behavior resembles retired service units. The longer he watched, the more the truth pressed on him. These were not pets. They were working dogs who had once served in serious roles. Yet what puzzled him most was not their discipline, but their devotion to Emily. Why her? Why a child? Why this level of protection? He noticed how Emily fit within the group, not as someone in charge of them, but as someone they had chosen. Her steps were small, thoughtful, quiet. She never tugged at the leashes or hurried the dogs. She moved as though she understood their rhythm and trusted it more than her own. Her silence seemed to belong to them, and their vigilance seemed to grow from something that had happened long before this routine began. One morning, a delivery truck rattled down the street faster than usual. The noise made the windows tremble slightly. Thomas watched as Arcana stepped half a pace ahead, his body firm and calm. The others mirrored his movement, forming a protective half-circle around Emily without any obvious cue. As the truck passed, the girl lifted her hand to touch Arcana's neck, a gesture filled with gratitude rather than fear. The dogs eased back into their positions, and the walk continued with the same gentle rhythm. Thomas felt an ache move through him, slow and heavy. Whatever had shaped these animals had also shaped this child. They held one another with a care that felt earned, not imposed. The bond between them whispered of loss of duty, of something precious held tightly so it would not slip away. As the morning procession disappeared toward the old depot, Thomas remained at the window long after they were gone. He sensed that the story behind those steady steps was waiting to rise to the surface. Something had forged the connection between that child and those disciplined hearts. And for reasons he could not yet name, he felt drawn to uncover it with a quiet determination of his own. The decision came quietly to Thomas one cool morning when the mist still clung to the roofs like a thin veil of memory. He had grown used to watching Emily pass, yet something deeper pushed at him now, a nudge that rose from an old place inside his chest. It was a feeling he had once ignored in his own life, back when he believed work could wait and time would always leave room for later. Later never came. His wife fell ill before he realized how much he had left unsaid, and his daughter moved to Seattle after a long argument he wished he could take back. All those missed moments left a hollow ache, and that ache whispered to him whenever he watched Emily walk alone through the soft morning light. So when the desire to understand her story grew too strong to ignore, Thomas stepped outside his door with a slow breath and decided to follow from a respectful distance. He kept far enough back to avoid upsetting the shepherds, but near enough to see each careful step the little girl took. Emily walked with a sense of purpose far beyond her years. Her boots tapped gently on the pavement, and her small shoulders lifted slightly with each breath, as if carrying a weight she dared not set down. Arcana stayed close, eyes shifting across the sidewalks and doorways with a vigilance that reminded Thomas of the K-9 units he once delivered mail beside. The other shepherds moved like a well-practiced team, completing a pattern they had memorized long ago. They passed the bakery where the warm scent of fresh loaves drifted onto the street. Emily glanced toward the window for the briefest moment, a flicker of longing crossing her face. Thomas wondered if it was hunger or memory. The shepherds kept steady pace beside her, their bodies forming a shield that softened her small frame from the world around her. They continued toward the florist shop where early roses brightened the display. The shopkeeper paused mid-sweep, letting her broom rest against her hip as she watched the little procession. The woman offered a friendly wave, but Emily only dipped her head politely and kept walking. Something in that quiet nod carried a gentleness that made Thomas stop in his tracks for a moment. This was not a child avoiding people. This was a child who had learned to move through life without expecting help. The group passed the corner where old oak trees stretched their branches over the sidewalk. The soft rustle of leaves filled the air. Thomas matched their pace from a distance, careful not to draw attention. He noticed how the dogs changed formation when a jogger passed or when a cyclist approached from the opposite lane. Their discipline was steady and fluid, as though they were guarding something sacred. The farther they walked, the more the peaceful neighborhoods thinned. Houses grew older, porches sagged, fences leaned. This part of town carried the quiet mark of time, a place where paint peeled and windows looked like tired eyes. Emily did not hesitate. She turned naturally down the narrow road leading toward the cluster of neglected homes near the old warehouse district. Thomas felt his heart tighten. Children did not wander into this area unless they had reason. He slowed his steps, but kept watching as Emily approached a weathered wooden gate, barely held together by rusted hinges. The dogs drew closer to her, their bodies shifting into a formation that reminded him of a protective circle. Emily pushed the gate open with a familiarity that sent a chill through him. The moment she stepped inside, shepherds relaxed. Their tails lifted just slightly, their eyes softened, and their bodies loosened from guard to comfort. Thomas glimpsed the faint movement of other dogs deeper within the yard, resting on old blankets under the sagging porch roof. He knew then that he had found a part of her world that no one else had seen. A place worn by time, but shaped by care. A place that held more questions than answers. The sight lingered in his thoughts, long after the gate closed behind her. Something important lived within those broken walls. Something that tied Emily to those disciplined animals in a way no one yet understood. And as Thomas walked slowly back toward his home, he sensed with growing certainty that his quiet life was about to change in ways he had never expected. The house behind the crooked gate carried the heavy stillness of places that once held life, but now clung to it only through memory. From where Thomas stood on the sidewalk, he could see the peeling paint curling like dried petals on the boards, the broken screen door swaying gently in the breeze, and the faint outlines of paw prints in the dirt leading toward the porch. Yet what held his attention most was the way the shepherds changed the moment they stepped inside. Minutes earlier, they had been alert, measured, scanning every movement along the street. Now their bodies softened, their tails lifted slightly, and their steps lost the rigid precision of patrol. It was clear to Thomas that this place worn as it was felt like home to them. Emily followed the dogs through the yard with a familiarity that made Thomas ache. She walked as though guided by routine, her small boots tracing a path already repeated countless times. When she reached the porch, one of the older shepherds rose slowly from its blanket. The dog's movements were stiff, hindered by age or injury, yet its face brightened when it saw her. Emily knelt beside it, her pink coat brushing the wooden boards, and rested her cheek gently against its head. The moment held a tenderness that tightened Thomas's throat. He stayed hidden near a clump of wild shrubs. He felt guilty spying on her, yet something in his heart insisted he stay. This was not simple curiosity anymore. It was concern. It was the same instinct that once pushed him to check on elderly neighbors along his mail route. It came from the part of him that still wished he had done more when his own family needed him. From his hiding place, he noticed more shapes moving inside the dim house. 2 dogs lay near the doorway, both wrapped in blankets, patched with careful stitches. A water bowl sat beside them, along with a few scattered bags of inexpensive dog food. On a small table near the porch railing, someone had arranged a row of medicine bottles, the kind used by veterinarians. Some labels were faded, and others were written in handwriting that looked too steady to belong to a child. Emily moved slowly among the resting dogs, tending to them with quiet focus. She checked each water bowl, patted shoulders gently, and adjusted blankets, so no one lay on cold boards. The dogs responded with trust. Not excitement, not playfulness, but trust. They watched her with eyes that carried long histories, eyes that understood loss and loyalty. Thomas stepped back as the weight of the scene settled into him. A child living among injured dogs. A child caring for animals that clearly had a past. A child who walked each morning with a group of highly trained guardians. He pressed a hand against his chest, feeling his heartbeat heavy and uneven. It was not just worry. It was recognition. He knew the marks of service dogs, the disciplined posture, the quiet resolve. These dogs had belonged to someone who trained them with devotion, someone who had served the community. And Emily, this little girl so small in her pink coat, had become their center, their reason to stay. For a moment, Thomas turned his gaze toward the street, considering whether he should say something to someone. But he knew the town. He knew how easily officials could misunderstand the sight of a child living among large animals. He feared that stepping forward too soon might bring more harm than help. As he hesitated, Arcana lifted his head from where he lay near the porch steps. His gaze moved straight toward the bushes where Thomas hid. There was no growl, no bark, only a calm awareness that passed between them like a silent greeting. Arcana did not step forward. He simply observed as though acknowledging Thomas without judgment. Thomas whispered a soft apology under his breath and began retreating slowly down the street. He walked with a heaviness that followed him all the way home, deeper with each step. He now knew where Emily went each morning. He knew there were dogs depending on her. And he knew she was carrying the responsibilities of someone far older than herself. Nothing about what he saw answered the questions he carried. Instead, it opened the door to even more. As he reached his front steps, he paused, staring at the quiet morning sky. Something within him shifted, a feeling both gentle and insistent. He could not let himself walk away from this. Not again. Not this time. The next morning brought a hush to Cedar Maple Street, the kind that settled over the town before most folks brewed their first cup of coffee. Thomas woke earlier than usual, stirred by a restlessness he could not ignore. The image of that worn house lingered in his thoughts, along with the quiet devotion he had witnessed between Emily and the shepherds. He brewed his coffee out of habit, yet found no comfort in the familiar scent. His mind stayed fixed on the yard with its patched blankets, the medicine bottles lying neatly on the porch table, and the older dogs who lifted their tired heads only when Emily knelt beside them. When the faint sound of footsteps finally drifted through his window, Thomas moved toward the curtains with a slow breath. There she was again, as steady as sunrise. Emily walked with her usual quiet resolve, her small boots tapping the pavement. The 5 shepherds formed their protective circle with the same careful grace as before their steps, more fluid than the day prior, as if reassured by the home they had returned to. But today the dogs carried a different energy. Thomas noticed it immediately. Their bodies were tense in places where calm usually lived. Their ears flicked at every sound, even the soft rustle of leaves. Arcana looked over his shoulder, more often checking surroundings with cautious eyes. It was as if the house had not only sheltered them, but stirred something deeper inside them, something that made them watch the world with renewed caution. Emily herself looked quieter than usual. Her shoulders sat a little lower beneath her pink coat, and her steps seemed slightly slower. Still calm, still composed, but gentler, as though she was carrying the weight of the previous day. Thomas felt a pang of worry, though he knew she had no way of recognizing him as anything more than another silent neighbor. He stepped outside, placing himself at a distance where he could watch without intruding. The early light brushed across her hair, and the shepherds cast long shadows on the pavement. The little group walked past the bakery, where Mrs. Ramirez paused at the window and pressed a hand to her chest, in the tender way of someone watching a child they wished they could help. When the procession reached the curve near the church, the dogs shifted again. One moved slightly ahead, scanning the road. Arcana stepped closer to Emily, his body angled protectively. Something in their behavior struck Thomas with sudden clarity. They were not simply alert. They were bracing, responding to something unseen, something carried in the air like a familiar scent. It became more apparent when a passing pickup truck slowed at the corner. Most dogs would bark or lunge at a strange vehicle approaching too closely, yet the shepherds did something else entirely. They tightened their formation around Emily in perfect unison. Their bodies lowered just slightly, their steps synchronized. They did not panic, and they did not break formation. It was the kind of response Thomas had only ever seen from working dogs who had trained through years of drills. The pickup truck passed, and Emily gently touched Arcanea's neck as though reassuring him, though Thomas sensed the comfort flowed both ways. The gesture struck him deeply. It was a moment not just between a child and a dog, but between two souls who understood responsibility in ways most adults never had to. For the first time, Thomas felt certain that these dogs once belonged to someone who had lived a life of duty. The idea made his heart tighten. Dogs like this were never abandoned. They were assigned, trained, and deeply bonded to their handlers. If they were now walking beside a child, something had happened to the one who trained them. Something painful. Something final. Emily continued her steady walk until she reached the narrow road that led toward the old district. Thomas followed from farther back than usual, unsure if he should keep observing or step forward. Yet when she reached the crooked gate, she paused. Arcana turned his head toward the end of the street. The others followed, their eyes focused on a sound Thomas could not yet hear. The air grew still. In that quiet moment, Thomas realized something important. He was no longer simply curious. He was invested. He had stepped into a story that had been unfolding long before he arrived in Hendersonville. Emily and her shepherds were carrying something delicate, something shaped by loss and loyalty, and he felt a calling he had not felt in years. As she disappeared behind the gate, and the dogs settled into their roles inside the yard, Thomas knew he could not step away from this path. Not when a child walked with such burden. Not when 5 loyal hearts stood guard over her like silent angels. The near accident happened on a morning that began like any other, wrapped in the soft quiet that settled over Hendersonville before the day grew busy. Emily walked with her usual calm, her pink coat brushing lightly against her sides as she moved along Cedar Maple Street. The 5 shepherds shaped their well-practiced formation around her. Arcana stayed nearest his steps, measured and steady as eyes, guiding the group as if reading the world before it arrived. Thomas followed from a distance, careful to remain unnoticed, yet driven by the same quiet concern that had grown stronger with each passing day. For a while, the town felt gentle and unthreatening. The bakery released its warm scent into the cool air. The florist shop opened its door and let the fragrance of early roses drift toward the sidewalk. A few neighbors waved from porches, though none approached. Emily nodded politely, her expression soft but reserved. The shepherds kept their rhythm, their steady rise and fall of paws, a kind of heartbeat for the morning. Then the peace broke. It began as a distant growl of an engine, low and uneven. Thomas lifted his head, searching for the source. The sound grew louder as it neared the curve by the old church. A pickup truck roared into view, speeding far too fast for the narrow residential road. The driver leaned forward in his seat, unaware or indifferent to the early morning calm he was shattering. Gravel scattered under the tires. The truck drifted dangerously close to the sidewalk where Emily walked. Arcana sensed the danger first. His head snapped toward the road, muscles tensing like a drawn bow. In a breath, the entire group responded. The lead shepherd dropped back. The rear shepherd surged forward. The 2 at her sides shifted inward. Arcana stepped ahead with a controlled force that carried both warning and devotion. Together they formed a living barrier, each dog placing its body between Emily and the oncoming truck. Their formation was flawless. Emily froze mid-step as the truck skidded. Thomas felt his heart leap painfully in his chest. He called out without thinking. The wind carried his voice away, but the moment had already turned. The driver slammed the brakes and yanked the wheel. Tires screamed. The truck veered, missing the group by a margin too thin for comfort, then crashed into a row of garbage bins near the church fence. Silence rushed in. Emily dropped to her knees beside Arcana, her small hand trembling as she touched his shoulder. The other shepherds stood firm, their bodies tall and alert, refusing to break their protective line until the danger had fully passed. She leaned into Arcana with a tenderness that twisted deep inside Thomas. The child was calm, yet her breath shook, ever so slightly. She whispered something soft and grateful, a murmur carried only to Arcana and the dogs who trusted her more than the world itself. The driver climbed out of the truck, shaken and irritated. He muttered under his breath and took a step toward them. The shepherds reacted at once, with a unified growl that warned him to keep his distance. He hesitated, raised his hands, and backed away without another word. Emily stood slowly, tugging her coat sleeve down as if hiding something beneath it. For a moment, Thomas saw a faint mark on her arm, a thin line that looked like an old burn or a healed medical scar. Before he could make sense of it, the dogs closed in again, guiding her away from the scene with quiet insistence. As they walked toward the road leading to the abandoned district, Thomas felt a heaviness gather in his chest. These dogs would risk everything for her. She carried something fragile and profound, something that called to him with a pull stronger than fear or doubt. He knew this was no ordinary child, and this was no ordinary bond. The video of the near accident traveled faster than anyone expected, carried from phone to phone until it reached corners of town where people rarely agreed on anything. It was recorded by a young man walking to work near the church. He had lifted his phone just in time to capture the moment when the pickup truck skidded across the road and the 5 shepherds moved like a single heartbeat around Emily. The stillness of the child, the courage of the dogs, the narrow escape. Everything unfolded in a few seconds, yet it revealed a depth of devotion that no words could describe. Within hours, neighbors replayed the clip at kitchen tables, on porches, and in shop doorways. Some cried out of fear for the child. Others shook their heads in disbelief at the discipline of the dogs. By mid-afternoon, the town's concern sharpened into action. Calls flowed into the local authorities. People did not want harm to come to Emily, but they feared for her safety and worried that the dogs, no matter how well trained, could be misunderstood or mishandled by children. They did not know the truth behind the routine. They did not understand the bond that shaped every step the shepherds took. They only saw a child walking alone. That was enough to stir alarm. The Office of Animal Control received a stack of reports, thicker than any they had seen in years. Some callers begged them to help Emily. Others requested that the dogs be checked for aggression. A few demanded that an adult intervene before tragedy struck. With so many voices pressing from every side, the authorities felt it necessary to respond. So early the next morning, a white vehicle from Animal Control moved quietly through town toward the old district. Inside sat 2 officers, both wary of the situation they expected to find. Hendersonville was a gentle place, but cases involving children always brought heavy responsibility. The younger officer held a clipboard with the reports clipped neatly in place. The older one adjusted his cap, scanning the street with a steady gaze shaped by years of calm judgment. Thomas watched from his porch as the vehicle passed. The sight made his stomach knot. He knew where the officers were headed. He knew they were not malicious. They were simply doing their job. Yet the thought of them approaching the worn house at the end of the road, the house he had seen with its blankets and medicine bottles and tired dogs, filled him with unease. Emily was alone there, carrying a burden too large for her age. The shepherd stood as her only shield. The vehicle stopped in front of the crooked gate. The officer stepped out and walked carefully toward the yard. Before they even reached the porch, a deep chorus of barks rose from inside the fence. The 5 shepherds appeared first, forming their protective line with a force of presence that stopped both officers in their tracks. Their bodies stood firm, not aggressive, but ready. Arcana held his position at the center, eyes fixed on the men, as though measuring their intent. The older officer spoke with a calm tone, trying to soothe the tension. He raised his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. The younger one reached for the papers on his clipboard, yet neither took another step. The dogs left no doubt about where they drew their line. Then Emily appeared in the doorway. Her pink coat looked smaller than ever against the worn boards behind her. She walked forward until she stood just behind Arcana, placing her hand on his back as if grounding herself in his presence. The barking softened instantly, replaced by a firm quiet that spoke louder than noise. The older officer asked a gentle question about her parents. Emily lowered her gaze and answered in a voice so soft the wind nearly carried it away. She said there were no parents at home, only her and the dogs. Her words fell like pebbles into still water, sending ripples across the air. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. His training told him this situation required action, yet the sincerity in her voice and the silent discipline of the shepherds made him hesitate. The older officer promised they would return with child services to understand the matter properly. He tried to reassure her. He spoke kindly, yet Emilia's shoulders tightened with fear. She whispered to Arcana. The dog pressed his head gently against her side. The other stood unwavering. From his place down the street, where he watched with a pounding heart, Thomas felt something shift inside him. This was no longer a quiet mystery he could simply observe. The world was closing in around a child who had carried too much sorrow on her tiny shoulders, and she stood facing it with nothing but 5 loyal companions. He understood then that he would need to step forward. He would need to be more than a watcher on a porch. The storm arrived before dusk, rolling over Hendersonville with a force that felt almost deliberate. Dark clouds pressed low over the rooftops, and the wind swept through Cedar Maple Street like a restless spirit, searching for a place to settle. Rain began as a whisper, then grew into sheets that pounded the pavement and turned the gutters into rushing streams. By the time evening settled, the entire town felt wrapped in a trembling curtain of water and rattling branches. Thomas stood at his window, his palms resting on the sill as he watched the storm swallow the dimming light. He had spent the entire day thinking of Emily and the quiet fear that had flickered across her small face when the officers promised to return. The image sat heavy in his chest, refusing to fade. The sense of responsibility he had felt for days now grew into something solid and urgent. He tried to read a book to distract his nerves. The words slipped past him. He attempted to brew tea. The cup cooled untouched. Every time the wind struck the side of the house, his heart lurched with the same thought. Emily was out there, alone except for her shepherds, sheltering in that fragile house that sagged under its own age. Rain hammered the roof with a rhythm that sounded too much like warning. When a bright flash lit the sky and thunder cracked so sharply that the porch railing shook, Thomas could no longer stay still. He threw on his coat without thinking, ignoring the ache that ran through his chest when he moved too quickly. He stepped out into the rain and let the wind push against him as he made his way toward the old district. Water streamed across the road. Branches snapped and flew in the air. The trees along Cedar Maple Street bent under the force of the storm, their limbs swaying like frantic arms. Thomas lowered his head and pushed forward a step, slower than he wished, but steady with determination. As he neared the worn house, he saw the crooked gate banging wildly in the wind. It hung open, one hinge nearly torn free. His heart tightened. The yard looked darker than usual. The porch light, weak on normal nights, flickered behind the curtain of rain. Then he heard it. A faint bark carried through the storm, strained and uneven. It was not the firm, controlled sound he had grown used to. It was desperate. Thomas hurried through the gate. His shoes splashed through deep puddles of mud as he climbed the porch steps. He tried the door. It was locked, but the old wood was soft from years of rain and neglect. He braced himself and pushed with all his strength. On the second attempt, the frame gave way, swinging inward with a groan. The smell of wet fur and cold air filled the room. Thomas lifted his flashlight and swept the beam across the shadows. Blankets soaked through. Water dripping from the ceiling. Bowls overturned by the wind that blew through a broken back window. In the far corner, Arcanus stood with his head lowered, his fur darkened by rain. He was not guarding now. He was pleading. The dog glanced at Thomas, then turned and moved down the hallway. Thomas followed, stepping through shallow pools forming on the warped floorboards. The wind wailed through the gaps in the walls. Thunder rolled again, shaking the narrow corridor. At the end of the hall, Thomas found her. Emily sat curled beside 2 older shepherds whose bodies trembled with cold. Her pink coat was soaked through, clinging to her small frame. Her hands rested on both dogs, trying to comfort them despite her own exhaustion. Her face was pale, her eyes half closed, her breathing shallow. Thomas dropped to his knees beside her. She looked up at him with the faintest flicker of recognition, as though she had known he would come. Her voice was too soft to rise above the storm, but he understood her plea. She needed help. The dogs needed help. This house could no longer shelter them from anything, let alone a night like this. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders and lifted her gently. Arcana pressed close, guiding each step as Thomas carried her down the hall. The older dogs struggled to rise, yet they pushed themselves forward, leaning against Thomas' legs as though asking him not to leave them behind. He moved slowly, supporting all 3 with every ounce of strength he had left. Rain slapped his face as he stepped back onto the porch. The night roared around them. Yet even through the chaos, Thomas felt something powerful settle into his heart. This child and her loyal guardians were no longer strangers at the edge of his days. They were now bound to him by need, by compassion, and by a promise he had not spoken aloud but felt in every step he took toward home. The storm had weakened by morning, leaving Hendersonville wrapped in a heavy quiet that settled like a blanket over the soaked streets. Thomas barely slept through the night. After carrying Emily and the older dogs into his home, he had moved carefully through the dim rooms, finding towels, blankets, and a place near the fireplace where the heat could reach them all. Arcana never left Emilia's side for a moment. The dog curled up close, his steady presence warming her through the long hours when her breathing stayed shallow. The other shepherds rested around them like a protective circle, their tired bodies finally easing under the safety of the small living room. By dawn, the storm had blown past the mountains, leaving branches scattered across yards and rooftops glistening with early light. Thomas stood by the window watching the sky shift from gray to pale gold, wondering what would happen now. Emily was safe in his home, finally sleeping soundly under a thick quilt. The dog, still damp but recovering, stayed alert yet calm, keeping silent watch over her. But he knew that peace would not last. The officers who had visited the day before had promised to return with child services. They would visit the worn house, find it empty, and begin asking questions. They would try to piece together what had happened, and they would not stop until they found Emily. Thomas felt the pressure of time pressing against his chest. He knew he could not hide her. Yet he also knew he could not let her face the world without someone by her side. When the clock neared 8, he wrapped a coat around himself and stepped outside, leaving the dogs to guard Emily. The ground squelched under his shoes, and puddles reflected the broken branches strewn across the street. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. As he walked toward the old district, his steps slowed. The crooked gate, once barely standing now, leaned farther, ripped by the force of the storm. The yard looked different in daylight. The blankets on the porch were soaked. The medicine bottles had toppled over. A few water bowls lay turned on their sides. Without Emily there to tend to everything, the place felt emptier than ever. He stepped inside the house to see it as the officers might see it. The dim light revealed the truth he had already sensed. This was not neglect. This was a sanctuary shaped by the small hands of a child, trying to keep a promise far bigger than herself. The patched blankets, the washed bowls, the careful arrangement of medicine. It was all Emilia's doing. The worn boards might have sagged, but the love in this place was steady. A soft noise outside drew Thomas back to the porch. He stepped out slowly and saw movement at the broken fence. A dog limped into view, one he had noticed before among the shadows. Older than the rest, its muzzle gray and eyes tired, yet it carried a dignity that touched him deeply. The dog approached a few steps before pausing, as if asking whether it was safe. Thomas crouched, letting his hands rest at his sides. The dog studied him, then walked past without fear, disappearing through the broken doorway, as though searching for the girl who had once cared for him. The sight tightened something inside Thomas's chest. This place was not only Emilias' refuge, it was the last shelter for animals who had spent their lives serving others. As he turned to leave, a glint on the floor near the table caught his eye. He lifted a small metal badge, its surface scratched but still marked with a familiar emblem. It belonged to a K9 unit engraved with numbers and letters that spoke of service and sacrifice. Holding it filled him with a chill. He understood now what these dogs had once been, and he understood why they stayed with Emily. He stepped back outside, pocketing the badge with a trembling breath. That was when he saw the white animal control vehicle approaching once again, followed by a police cruiser. They were coming, and they would find an empty house, a broken gate, and questions waiting for answers. Thomas walked toward them, slowly feeling the morning sunlight warm the back of his coat. He no longer intended to stay in the shadows. He had taken Emily into his home. He had made a choice in the storm, and now he would have to stand by that choice. What he did not know was that by stepping forward, he would uncover a truth that reached far deeper than the old house or the loyal dogs within it. a truth that lived in the heart of a child who had never stopped trying to honor the memory of the one she loved most. The officers approached the broken house with the kind of careful steps people use when they expect trouble but hope not to find it. Thomas stood near the gate, his coat still damp at the edges, his breath steady but heavy with everything he had witnessed in the past days. He had never imagined he would place himself at the center of something so delicate, yet he felt no hesitation now. Emily was asleep in his home. The shepherds rested around her, and the truth that had been hidden behind these worn walls was finally rising into the light. The older officer reached the porch first. He paused, letting his eyes travel across the soaked blankets, the overturned bowls, the collapsed medicine bottles. His brow creased not with judgment, but with sorrow. The younger officer followed his clipboard tucked under one arm as he scanned the interior with a more procedural gaze. Yet even he stopped short when he saw the careful arrangements Emily had made. This was not abandonment. This was devotion. A stillness settled over the porch as both men absorbed the scene. The older officer crouched near a scattered line of stitched blankets, brushing his hand lightly over the fabric. He had inspected many homes in his career, but none had carried this blend of hardship and tenderness. He stood slowly and spoke in a quiet voice that carried the weight of understanding. This isn't a danger zone. This is a shelter. The younger officer nodded, his face softening. And these dogs weren't being mistreated. They were being cared for. Really cared for. Thomas felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders. He sensed their hearts shifting as they looked around. He knew this moment mattered. It would shape whatever came next for Emily. Inside the house, the older dog who had wandered in earlier lay on a cushion Emily had placed under the patched window. The officers noticed him. The younger one stepped closer, checking the dog's bandaged leg. Whoever did this had training. These aren't sloppy bandages. Someone knew what they were doing. Thomas spoke for the first time. His voice came out low, steady. She tried her best. Both officers turned to him. The younger one blinked, surprised. Thomas nodded. These dogs didn't have anyone else. She did what she could. A long silence settled, broken only by the soft drip of water from the rafters. The older officer stepped forward, his expression gentler than before. He cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. "Sir, do you know where the child is now?" Thomas met his gaze without wavering. "She's safe. Not in this storm," the officer said softly. "No child should have been here alone." "She wasn't alone," Thomas replied. "She had them. And they had her." The younger officer looked around once more, taking in every detail. He exhaled slowly, the weight of understanding settling over him. "I think we need to call this what it really is. This girl wasn't hiding animals. She was protecting them." The older officer nodded. The report said 5 shepherds walked with her every morning. They guarded her like a trained team. These dogs aren't backyard pets. These are retired service animals. Thomas stepped aside as the officer climbed the porch steps. A small framed photograph lay half buried beneath a fallen blanket. He picked it up, wiped the glass clean, and studied the image. A man in uniform stood proudly beside the same shepherds now resting in the battered house. The badge number, the emblem, the steady eyes of a man who had served with honor. The officer's voice softened with recognition. This man trained K9 units, and those markings on the collars, they matched the old service registry. These dogs were his partners. Thomas swallowed hard. The truth had always been waiting here in the quiet corners. Emily had not chosen these dogs. They had chosen her. The younger officer lowered his gaze and sighed. "We can't take them. Not now. Not after seeing this." The older one nodded in solemn agreement. "No. We treat this like a legacy, and we make sure she gets help, not punishment." For a moment, the early light filled the broken room, touching each sleeping dog with a soft glow. It felt like a blessing of sorts, a gentle acknowledgement of the devotion shared between a child and her loyal guardians. Thomas stepped back as the officers gently taped a notice to the broken door. Under care of temporary guardian until further review, for the first time in days, Thomas let himself breathe fully. He knew the path ahead would not be simple, but he also knew he would not walk it alone. The story behind Emilia's quiet courage was rising, and soon the world would understand the truth she'd carried in silence for far too long. The news traveled through Hendersonville, the way warm light spreads through a room at sunrise, slow at first, then steady and unstoppable. Word moved from porch to porch, from shop counters to church pews, from the soft conversations of early risers to the hushed voices of folks who had only seen Emily from behind their curtains. People who once whispered in confusion now spoke with a trembling mixture of sorrow and admiration. The officers had said little, but the little they said was enough to stir the hearts of the entire town. A child had been caring for retired service dogs. A child had been living in a broken house, better suited for memories than for shelter. A child had been honoring the legacy of a father who had given everything he had to protect others. By the end of the day, the town was no longer curious. It was shaken, awed, and ashamed. At the bakery, Mrs. Ramirez wiped her eyes as she arranged warm loaves on the counter. She had watched Emily pass by so many times, wishing she could step out and offer a soft meal or a warm coat. She never did, believing someone else surely would. Now she realized how alone that little girl had truly been. She prepared a basket that morning with bread, soup, and a small scarf she knitted years ago, but never had a chance to give to anyone. At the florist shop, the owner gathered a few sturdy blankets from her supply closet, the kind she used to protect fragile plants on cold nights. She folded them neatly, imagining the resting shepherds who once lay on worn quilts in that broken house. Near the retirement home, old friends sat together on a bench, shaking their heads with a mix of grief and disbelief. They had lived long enough to know that burdens fall hardest on those least prepared to carry them. Yet they had never expected to see such weight on the shoulders of a child so small. One of the men, a retired deputy, rose with a sigh and said he would visit the station to offer whatever help he could. By midday, the local police department had become a gathering place for officers from nearby towns. Many had served with K-9 units in their younger years. When they heard about Emily, memories rose from deep within them. Memories of long nights, difficult missions, and the unwavering loyalty of dogs, who once trusted them with their whole hearts. They asked how they could help. They offered time supplies, resources, and most importantly, they offered respect. Meanwhile, at his home on Cedar Maple Street, Thomas stayed close to the living room, where Emily slept beneath a warm quilt. The shepherds lay around her in a protective circle. Arcana rested with his chin close to her hand, watching her with eyes that held both devotion and fatigue. For the first time since Thomas had met them, the dogs looked peaceful, as if they finally felt the weight of danger begin to lift. In the quiet afternoon hours, Thomas made a few calls of his own. He had not spoken much about his daughter in Seattle, nor about the long ache that came from their years of silence. But seeing Emily that night in the storm, frail and trembling, yet still reaching out to comfort the older dogs beside her, had stirred something deep inside him. It had reminded him of the love he once felt for a little girl with pigtails who used to hold his hand on summer walks. He found the courage to dial his daughter's number. When she answered, her voice carried the soft surprise reserved for calls long overdue. Their conversation was slow and hesitant at first, but kindness found its way into the pauses. He told her he missed her. She told him she missed him too. As the sun drifted toward the horizon, the town continued to gather strength around a child who had given everything she had to protect the ones left in her care. Strangers left food and blankets at the station door. Retired handlers brought their old training manuals and offered to help rebuild the worn house into something safer. They did not yet know the full story behind Emily's devotion. They did not know the details of her father's sacrifice. But they knew enough to open their hearts. And in the small home where the fire crackled gently in the hearth, Thomas watched Emily sleep and felt a quiet shift within himself. Life had given him a second chance he never expected. A chance to stand with someone who needed him. A chance to step forward instead of stepping back. a chance to heal the parts of himself that had long gone unattended. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one truth. The town was no longer whispering. It was ready to rise for her, and he would rise with it. The following days brought a change to Hendersonville that settled softly over the town like the first warm breeze of spring, gentle yet full of promise. People who once watched Emily from behind curtains now stepped into the open with faces full of tenderness. Police officers from nearby towns arrived carrying folded uniforms, framed photographs, and memories of the K-9 officer who had once served at their side. Local families brought warm meals to Thomas's porch. Retired veterinarians offered their skills. Everything gathered around Emily like the pieces of a puzzle that had waited for years to come together. When she woke in Thomas's home, sunlight drifting gently across the quilt, she looked around with the quiet confusion of someone who had learned not to expect comfort. Arcana lifted his head, touching her hand with a soft nudge that reassured her everything was all right. The other shepherds stirred from their rest, forming their familiar circle around her. Thomas knelt beside her, his voice warm and steady. "You are safe now." Emily sat up slowly, still wrapped in the lingering fatigue from the storm. She looked at the fireplace, the blankets, the dogs, then at Thomas, with eyes that carried a lifetime of hardship far too heavy for a child her age. She did not speak at first. She simply reached out and rested her hand on Arcana's neck, as though grounding herself in the only constant she had known. That afternoon, the officers who had visited the broken house returned, but not with worry or suspicion. This time they came with gentle purpose. They brought supplies, information, and a promise to help. When they stepped into Thomas's home, the room softened. The oldest dog lifted his head, recognizing the scent of uniforms that once meant purpose and partnership. One officer knelt to meet Emily's gaze. His voice was low and kind. "Your father served with honor. These dogs were part of his team. They stayed with you because they never forgot him. And they will not lose you now." The girl held her breath for a moment, as though the weight of memory and love pressed against her all at once. Then she nodded slowly, her small hands gripping Arcana more tightly. In the days that followed, the community began helping Thomas repair the old house. Not to send Emily back there alone, but to transform it into a place worthy of the love she had poured into it. The worn boards were replaced with fresh lumber. The sagging roof was strengthened. Clean bedding, food, and medical supplies filled the space. What had once been a forgotten corner of Hendersonville grew into a sanctuary for retired service dogs, a living tribute to Officer Daniel Carter. People called it the Carter Haven, but Emily called it home in her own quiet way. She still lived with Thomas, who became the steady presence she had never allowed herself to hope for. He helped her with meals, kept her company on cold evenings, and learned how to listen to the soft rhythms of her days. The shepherds moved freely between the haven and his house, their loyalty undimmed by the changes around them. As the weeks passed, Thomas noticed that Emily began to smile more often. Not the brief, polite nods she once gave strangers, but real smiles that reached her eyes and warmed the room. She started speaking in soft tones, sharing little pieces of her memories, the way her father taught her to brush Arcana's coat, the stories he told her about bravery and kindness. Each word was a thread, stitching her past to her present. One morning, a small ceremony gathered in the newly restored yard. Police officers in crisp uniforms stood beside townsfolk holding flowers and handmade signs. A plaque was placed near the porch, engraved with simple words that carried years of sacrifice and love. In memory of Officer Daniel Carter, his loyalty lives on in the hearts. He protected Emily, stood with Thomas beside her, and the 5 shepherds at her feet. Arcana stayed closest, his calm presence grounding them all. When the officers saluted, the dogs lifted their heads with quiet dignity, as though honoring the man they once followed. After the ceremony, the townspeople offered gentle smiles and warm wishes. Children approached the shepherds, carefully receiving patient tail wags in return. Older residents wiped their eyes discreetly. The haven had become a place where sorrow found healing and loyalty found new purpose. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long golden rays across the yard, Emily looked up at Thomas. "You helped us," she whispered. "You stayed." Thomas felt a warmth rise in his chest, the kind he had not felt since his daughter was small. "I stayed because all of you gave me a reason to." Arcana pressed his nose into Emily's shoulder. The other shepherds settled close, forming the quiet circle that had always held her safe. In that moment, surrounded by love rebuilt from loss, Emily felt something she had not known for a long time. She felt at home. Before leaving the haven that evening, Thomas knelt beside her. "Your father would be proud, not only because you cared for his dogs, but because you cared with your whole heart." Emily looked toward the plaque, her small hand resting on Arcania's back. "He taught me that love should never be left behind." As they walked toward Cedar Maple Street under the softening light, the dogs moved around them with gentle steps, no longer guarding out of fear, but guiding with devotion. The town that once whispered now watched with admiration, touched by the quiet courage of a little girl and the loyalty of 5 faithful companions. And as the evening breeze carried the last glow of daylight across the rooftops, the story of Emily and her shepherds settled into the heart of Hendersonville forever. It became a reminder that love shapes the strongest bonds, that loyalty can rise from even the deepest sorrow, and that healing often begins the moment someone chooses to stay. If this story warmed your heart, consider sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps stories like this find their way to others. And if you wish to hear more gentle tales of courage, compassion, and hope, remember to like and subscribe.